3, 2, 1.
Here we go!
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Studio Life. I'm Mark Nicholas here on the MBS Media Campus lot, and this is our stage here, Manhattan Beach Studios. And today I want to talk about something that I know is one of the more agonizing points when it comes to selecting hardware or software, and that's what kind of switcher should I get? There's so much news out there when it comes to VMix or ATEM, and we talk about Blackmagic and OBS and TriCaster and all this other stuff. And the question really that we have to ask ourselves is, what's best? Is it hardware or is it software? Is ATEM better than VMix? And those are the two brands that are most commonly discussed out there. And I can tell you, we in this studio, we use both, and we love both. Both of them are incredible systems. I will say that to me, when it comes to these two systems, each one has its place. Some of them are better at some things and others at other things. And it really makes sense to try to figure out what you're going to do. Now, I know that's a throwaway answer, but it happens to be completely true. You can easily buy a hardware switcher and then be terribly frustrated at the limitations of that hardware switcher. And there's no way around them because hardware is hardware. The buttons are the buttons. On a software switcher, it's incredibly capable. Generally, these software switchers can do everything the hardware switchers can do, with a handful of exceptions. And so let's take a quick second. We'll talk about that right after this. And here we go. Let's get into this particular subject and let's talk about software switchers and hardware switchers. Now, for many, many years, talking decades, hardware switchers was the only place to be. Inside the hardware switcher, we had all of our inputs. We had the ability to switch between different program views or different input views. And so it was pretty straightforward. Inside one of those inputs, if we had a still that we wanted to play, we had to show the still. If we had another video, we had to have a video player going into those inputs. In many ways, that has not changed. Video switchers are still based on the inputs of the videos, and then they switch them. ATEMs are no different. They have a bunch of inputs. You take those inputs in, and then you decide which ones you're going to show. Now, we'll talk about a couple of the enhancements to these video switchers, such as the ability to have a media library. So now you can have, in the case of ATEM, up to 2 images, or in some cases, little mini movies that are there waiting for you at all times to play. And that's cool-ish. You know, I think it's a terrible limitation, to be honest. And this is a good time to tell you that this is an unsponsored video. And it's also unvarnished. And I'm willing to say whatever I want to say. And I will tell you, when it comes to ATEM, I think this would have been an easy ad to have a lot of graphics available, but it's only 2. And the only way to add and change any of those 2 is to have a computer connected to it. Now, again, there are advanced panels. There are other ways of controlling some of that media library. But in general, 2. That's what you get. No exceptions. On a software switcher, you have the ability to switch, in many cases, from a virtually infinite number of inputs. Those inputs can have a lot of things. They could have stills or movies or graphics. They can have layers, which is super cool. Like you can layer an image over the top of an image with another title. And you can do all of that and basically switch to it at the push of a button. Really unbelievably amazing. So that's the difference. One of them is sort of an all-inclusive system. The other one is not. But now let's talk about what makes one different, really, truly different from another. If you were to look at an ATEM system, which is the most economical of the hardware switchers, you'll notice there are either SDIs or HDMIs on the back. In the case of some of their high-end production rack units, I know there might be one HDMI in a world of SDIs, but really it's either SDI or HDMI. Some switchers that are hardware-based, they all have to match. The inputs all have to match. So if one of them is at 1920 by 1080 at 2997, all of them have to be at 1920 by 1080 at 2997. This is an area where a lot of these systems can fail. If one camera's off, that input is gone. In recent years, we've seen scaling, meaning those inputs each can look at whatever input's coming in as long as it's within their range. Like if it's not a 4K switcher, it should not be a 4K input. But within that range, it can then take that input and match it, scale it, both in terms of size and in frame rate, to the other particular inputs. And so that's all pretty cool. That is an improvement we're seeing. It does not cover all of the switchers that are out there, but it now covers really most of the switchers that are coming out. Now, a limitation on really all of the ATEMs and almost all of the switchers that exist in the hardware space is that it's HDMI or SDI. So if you have an HDMI signal and you want it to come into an SDI switcher, you have to convert it. It's an extra piece of gear, it's an extra plug, and it's an extra area for something to go wrong. And now let's talk about software switchers. Software switchers, in many cases, do not have the ability to receive any camera signals whatsoever. So the ability to have a camera signal has to come from some other source. Now, this can be a capture device. I use here in the studio an AJA IO4K Plus that has the ability to receive 4 HD SDI or HD 3G signals that can come in via mostly SDI, but there's one HDMI signal that can come in. You can have a desktop system with a PCI card or a PCIe card that has a lot more inputs. For instance, we have an AJA card. We also have a Blackmagic Decklink card as well that can have inputs. But without a capture device, you don't have the ability to bring in cameras, and so you're kind of stuck. So in a hardware switcher, you have all the inputs. On a software switcher, you have to come up with the inputs. You might be able to utilize other technologies. For instance, you may have a camera that is inside the computer. In this particular case, I happen to have that. So if you were to look at my software switcher right now, I'm sending out a picture of me. And I can switch to that, maybe. There we are. So now I'm on camera. That is coming through my software switcher, and that is my webcam. And so I do have the ability to have that camera. Other cameras that are built in to a software switcher may be NDI cameras. NDI means an internet-based system where you can receive picture that's in the studio environment. So if you have a PTZ camera, for instance, putting out NDI, that's on the network, and if your computer's plugged in, you can take that as a video signal. But again, you're doing your best to come up with a way to get the signals into the computer. You need that capture device. On a hardware switcher, you don't. So that's all really some of the core differences. Another example of a difference might be that a computer-based system is a computer-based system. You have to turn on the computer, you have to run the software, and you do run the risk of crashing. On a hardware switcher, you generally don't. Most of these are extraordinarily reliable, and that's pretty amazing. On a software switcher, you actually have to figure out, again, not just how to get the signals into the computer, but how to get the signals out of the computer. For instance, you might want to be recording on an external monitor or external record device. Here in the studio, we use a lot of ATEM systems where we send our video signal out. I'm not a big fan of recording in the computer. It makes the drives have to work a little harder, the CPU a little harder, the graphics card a little harder. I prefer to take that burden off of my computer system, and therefore I use an external monitor. On a hardware switcher, you have external outputs called AUXs. You can send out 1 or 2 if, in the case of most ATEMs. On a higher end ATEM, you may get 10 or more AUX outs. And those AUX outs can be used pretty much for anything. They could be used for records. They could be used for isolated camera records. They could be used for projecting to recording to screens in a venue. All of these are super cool things that these AUXs allow you to do. On a software switcher like the Decklink card, you might be able to assign inputs into outputs or convert inputs into outputs. You can utilize NDI as a technology that gets an input or gets a program feed or something like that to an output. You can have multiple monitors maybe where you're connected and you might be able to pull an output. But you can see how hard it is to work. You really have to start thinking about the outputs. On the ATEM systems, you have most of them now, the small ones, the little minis, even those will have 2 AUX outputs. Now, it's worth starting to talk about the layout of a particular hardware system. I happen to have here an HS-3200 system by Datavideo. And I'll tell you why I like that in a second. The next thing to talk about, though, are these overlays. And so in the world of software-based switchers, it's very easy to have an overlay. You just have the overlay as an input and you play it. It may have an alpha layer built in, so it automatically has a transparent layer or translucent layer, allowing you to overlay the input on top of the other platforms. So for instance, here, if I am utilizing this computer, and let me just bring that up, you can see that I have the computer screen, but now I'm going to overlay a title. So this is something that a software-based switcher can do. A hardware-based switcher has to figure out how to pull that off. And we could do that in a lot of different ways again, but it's hardware-based. And so on an ATEM, you may only have two pieces of graphics in the media, and you have to figure out how to create an overlay graphic out of those. But you may also use a software switcher or a graphic generator on the side, like VMix, in conjunction with the hardware switcher, allowing you to add the graphics. So there are a lot of ways of pulling this off. But ATEM, you could clearly see that's a limitation. The ability to have this kind of live graphic action without another computer feeding that in is going to be a limitation. And therefore, you're still in the software space. And then comes, I think, the last point. When we have a production, or we're feeding graphics to other screens, or we're recording and it's all out of a software switcher, there's a delay. That delay is truly noticeable. It can be a third of a second. It can even be a little bit longer. So if you're feeding screens simultaneously, then you might want to consider a hardware switcher. Now, there are hybrid solutions. You could utilize software and hardware at the same time so that you have the benefits of a software switcher while you may be feeding back certain elements of the video, the picture, to screens, but it becomes a little bit more complicated. Most productions that are trying to feed screens in real time are using a hardware switcher on the front end. There's less latency, a lot more speed, and then they're adding the graphics and other things later in the process. Let's talk about keys. We talked about that. We touched on that when it came to the ability to overlay graphics. A software switcher keys, they're in many cases unlimited. In the case of VMix, while it looks like you only have 4 keys, you actually have a rather infinite collection because you can take a layer and add more layers to it. And all of that counts as one particular image. And then on top of that, you still have your 4 overlay channels. On a hardware switcher, you're never going to get an unlimited number of overlay channels. So I think that sort of wraps up this beginning, and now let's get into the hardware itself. All right, we're back. Now, I chose to not bring out an ATEM because so many of us are familiar with the general features. I did want to bring out another system that we use called the DataVideo HS-3200, which is truly a favorite of mine. But let's start out with VMix. And so if you were to look here to my left, there is a Microsoft Surface tablet, Surface computer, I don't know what you want to call it, that is playing VMix. And so if I were to come in over here, you can see down over my shoulder is a VMix box, and that multi-view input looks just like this. So, that's pretty much what a VMix system looks like. Let me slide over, and there's your VMix system right there. You could see it's basically a keyboard and a bunch of inputs set up. You can also see something really cool, which is that there's a mixer right there. You can see that there's an audio mixer here that is very easy to access, and you can have all kinds of different inputs, whether they're coming from the camera or they're coming from a video that you're playing. All of these things are things that hardware switchers generally do not have. A hardware switcher generally switches picture. Okay? And so then if you were to look at the multi-view, here's the multi-view. And you can see there are a bunch of inputs. There are a couple of videos over there. There's a website. You could see somebody moving their fingers around. You could see me, by the way. Here I am. That is off of the internal integrated camera. We can add overlays, and so you could see this here. If you were to pull up this particular overlay, you can have, let's say, another image, and then you could put an overlay over the top of it. So it's a very, very functional system. Super cool system. And the rest of the overlay allows you to basically select the particular inputs. You could see that's on the inputs on the left. You could see as a preview, you could see the program feed on the right. You can set up all kinds of shortcuts. Cut, fade. Maybe do a cool little cube zoom here. Bam. Looking good. And so with that in mind, you can see how integrated a software-based system is. So the downside to the software-based system, a couple things. Number one, it has to be a computer. So it can crash. It can have its issues. Generally, VMix, OBS, TriCaster, so again, when it comes to a software-based switcher, it can have its issues. It's a computer. It can crash. But you have VMix, OBS, TriCaster, all very stable programs, very reliable programs. So, you know, bad things can happen, but most of the time it doesn't happen. You have to come up with another capture input. You have to come up with another way of getting a picture back out. All of those things are limitations of software-based switchers. Now, our hardware-based switcher is a little bit different. Our system, the one that we like, is this system right here. This is the HS-3200. The reason why we like this is because all of those things that we talked about with ATEM, this pretty much has it. There are only a couple of things ATEMs have that this doesn't. But what this does is it has a lot of the features that we need built right into the interface itself. So when we're talking about having a media library, when it comes to the ability to choose different graphics, the ATEM has 2. This one has, I think, 200. So for instance, I'm able very quickly to put up other stills that are preloaded into the interface. And I could do that all in real time. I can load all of those and then assign them to individual inputs. I can also assign them to 2 additional stills libraries, and they're all preloaded. So that's going to be something you pay a little bit more money for. In this particular case, this unit retails at $7,500. But don't be afraid of that number, because you can buy this thing on eBay very often for something way cheaper. And I'm embarrassed to say how little I paid for this particular unit, but I could tell you it was a small fraction of what it goes for. But there are a lot of other things associated with this particular unit. So if you were to look at the interface of the unit itself, you'll notice along the bottom, we have preview buttons. Top row, we have program buttons. So from here, I'm able very quickly to switch to whatever I want to show. So push of a button. And you can see how quickly that works. Just like an ATEM or any other hardware switcher, I can pick another input. Let's pick this pretty cartoonesque overlay or a graphic, and now if I wanted to, I can bring it right on the screen. In addition, along this bottom row, I have lots of other little features built in. For instance, I could bring up stills and apply them to other input buttons quickly. I can push out the multi-views. I can load in what they call flex. So here's a situation where I might come up here to my shift button, and now I want to load in a flex. Which adds 4 particular overlays to the screen. So all of these are really kind of cool looks. Now this particular unit, unlike an ATEM, which might have, 2, maybe 4 upstream keyers, this unit essentially has 4 built in. As you could see, if I were to load in, let's say, me up here, and then let me load in my controller from there, you could see that I actually have a total of 8 overlays. I can take a background plus 4 overlays built into what they call the flex. And then on top of that, I have 4 more. So if you're having a gaming environment and you have 4 competitors and 4 screens, this is a great way to do it. There are a couple other features of this particular unit, again, that overcome the limitations of a software-based switcher. So 3 core features that are worth talking about. Number 1, the capture is built into the system. And so if you were to look at the capturing, and you forgive me for moving cameras around in real time, you'll notice off the back of the system there are a total of 8 SDI inputs. Of those 8 SDI inputs, all of them can be assigned to any of the 12 inputs that you have here on the front of the unit. But if you look just to the side of those units over to the left, you'll notice there are 4 HDMI units. So we talked about the limitations of ATEMs where you only had SDI or HDMI. Here, you have 4 HDMIs and 8 SDIs, and they all have scalers attached. So really, whatever output you want, this particular unit will convert all of those inputs into that unit. It will scale them, it will sync them, and you can switch them. So right now, I only have 1 input on the HDMI, which happens to be my computer. And I could switch to the computer. That can be a PowerPoint, it can be graphics, it can be a character generator, it can be a remote VMix system for adding lower thirds, it could be anything I want it to be. And you can see that those inputs are all built in. Right above it, you can see that there are 2 XLR line level audio inputs. This does not have phantom power, unfortunately. It has 3 and 4 here, but the company DataVideo decided not to make them functional. It's one of my criticisms of DataVideo. It's sort of a 90% gear. The 10% got left off and seems to be out of development. But those 2 line level inputs are pretty solid. As you look to the right, you'll notice there are 6 more outputs, 6 more SDIs. Those are aux outputs. That's pretty incredible that you not only have the 8 SDI inputs, the 4 HDMI inputs, and now you have 6 SDI outputs. Those could be used to assign anything you want. So I could assign a multi-view for a director off of one of them, a program view for a recorder. I can take 4 more cameras and send each one of them out for isolated recorders. And then above that, you'll notice there are 3 HDMI outputs. Those are functional outputs too, and you can assign whatever you want to those. That means I can be driving screens, projection. I can do whatever I want out of those. So I have 9 aux outputs to use off of this system. That's more than any software-based system I've ever used. That's the benefit of a hardware-based system. There are some other interesting features about this. Like, for instance, you'll notice there are XLRs or Ethernet. One of them is how you connect to the control of this system. The other one is how you stream, because there happens to be a stream encoder in this unit. I will tell you, I always have mixed feelings about using encoders that are kind of built into hardware. I just always don't know. I've done that a lot with, I've done that quite a bit with, there we are. I've done that quite a bit with ATEM. I've used this. I've had very good results, but sometimes I just like to see the lights and all the action on the screen. So sometimes I lean toward using other encoders, but there is an encoder built in. So it's a pretty unbelievable collection of things. Again, we can get back to the VMix where I have pictures in picture, but here also I have picture in picture. I can pop something up at the push of a button. The speed in which I work off a hardware encoder is a huge advantage. Building the shortcuts off of a software encoder takes a little bit more time, but again, once you're dialed in, fantastic. If you use the Envato or the Elgato Stream Deck, you can essentially create a lot of hardware buttons that apply to the software switcher, And for extremely complicated shoots, we've used BitFocus Companion and done a great deal more of programming when it came to utilizing those. But let's come back and let's focus briefly on this hardware. I can do everything that the ATEM can do, it feels like, and more when it comes to some of these transitions. So, for instance, if all I want to do is fade on this picture-in-picture, I can hit the button that says "Do not transition anything but that." I hit that button, and bam, it's off. I want to bring it back on. I could hit a button, and bam, it's on. All of that is really cool. I have other transitions as well. For instance, I could, oops, let's come back to that. There we go. I could, for instance, add in stingers. You cannot do stingers really on ATEMs. You really, for the most part, can't do stingers on most systems. But here, I could do a system where I come in, I apply my my preview, and then, bam. Really cool. I can set an auto button and just make that switch. Super cool. So you can use any of their 12 goofy stingers, or you can go and build your own and put them in, and you've got yourself a pretty cool stinger. It doesn't have sound effects, so again, software is better. If you want sound effects on your stinger, you can go with the old traditional way of handling it with HyperDecks or other systems where you may have sound effects, but you at least have stingers, which is super cool. And then you have wipes. So for instance, I could hit a button over here on this side, turn on the wipe, and now, well, it helps if I have a different thing in my preview, and now, there you go. I've got wipes. I could change the speed, or I can grab my T-bar and move it at my speed. Boom. Super fun. We talked about flex already. But now let's talk about a couple of the other really, really cool things about this hardware switcher. Things that are not as easy to do on a software switcher without shortcuts and or scripting. So off of this particular unit, let's say I want to use a picture-in-picture, and I want to pop that onto the bottom here. But at some point in the production, somebody wants a different input. So what I could do, let's come out, is I can simply hold down a button, and I can assign that input to be something else. And now notice how quickly that is something else. So now it's one of the graphics. Now, we might want to ask, why is that so unbelievably important? And it's really unbelievably important for one primary reason, which is sometimes we're controlling screens. So off of an ATEM, they tend to call this MEs. Now you can apply a different input to an ME, but an input theoretically is about a different mix. Here, at least, you can apply different inputs to those. So if at some point somebody wanted to see a PowerPoint, I can hit a button and I can send a PowerPoint out to a screen. So over here on my right, I happen to have another screen. And you can see on that screen currently is a copy of this kind of bland camera output of the screen. So it's the screen of the screen. But let's say I want to change that. Right now I have that on aux 2. Pretend I'm in a concert theater and I want to change the input to, let's say, the computer screen that I have on input 9. I can come in here and I can hold down my aux button. And I could see currently my aux 2 is set to, let me bring this down a little bit more. Currently my aux 2 is set to 2, but I could take my aux 2 and set it to 9. And now you could see, if you look carefully, that the screen has changed. I can take that now and I want to set it, let's say, to graphic 4. Bam, graphic 4. I can go back to 9, and now I can go back to 2 or 1. So you can see it. It's hard to see in this screen. There we are. I got confused for a second. So the ability to change a key or to change an aux instantaneous off of this hardware switcher. So that is a summary of the differences between software and hardware switchers. There are no macros off of this particular unit. ATEMs allow macros. ATEMs allow super source for moving pictures around. You can do a lot of the similar things. You can do a lot of similar things off of VMix, but it takes some programming and scripting. The ATEM system for how you use super source is pretty amazing. Here you still do have the flex. I hope that helps to explain a little bit of the difference between hardware and software and why on most jobs, unless I'm trying to do something particularly crazy, I actually lean toward using hardware switchers. And most people who are in broadcast lean toward hardware switchers as well. Less delay, instant reliability, the buttons are all there. And then you can put somebody else on a computer and let them feed you some graphics. Or you could do it yourself. If you've got any more questions, definitely tune in. If you got any more questions, definitely subscribe, ask questions, let me know what's up. We'd love to help you out. Have a good day.
3, 2, 1.